Ibrahim Haddad is one of the foremost scholars and practitioners of open source on the planet. You have been so generous with LF Energy, and thank you very much for doing this. I hope you are safe and well, and everyone enjoyed themselves. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Shuri and Carly. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ibrahim Haddad, and today I will be speaking to you about mastering open source. So this seminar or webinar has been set up with LF Energy and aims to give participants kind of an overview of how to become very good at consuming open source, at being in compliance with the licenses, at contributing to open source, and driving a company from really a user position into a leadership position. So the agenda for today is over several kind of sections. I will start talking about the OSPO's open source program offices, what is an OSPO and why they're important, how can you structure a program office for open source within a given organization, kind of a little bit about the life cycle of OSPOs, and this is really kind of my private observations given the work I've been doing in OSPOs in various organizations. Then I will talk about staffing of such offices, the roles and responsibilities, and of course, the challenges faced by organizations when setting up program offices to manage the intake and outtake of open source across the whole organization. And I will end with a number of recommendations on how, as a company, you can make an impact through your open source development efforts. So throughout the presentation, please feel free to ask questions in the chat window. I'm keeping an eye on the chat window, and when I see questions, I will pause and take the questions. So I will go a little bit in detail about the first part of the presentation, and on the recommendations, I will kind of go a little bit fast to make sure there's time for Q&A. And also, I assume the presentation will be made available to you so you can have it handy for later use. So OSPOs, why and what? So in the past few years, we've been hearing a lot about open source program offices and organizations setting up program management teams to be responsible for open source efforts across the whole organization. And this is really just a reflection of the opportunities posed by open source and the importance of open source across development efforts. So today you can be a company in finance, in energy, you can be a network provider, a mobile operator, you can be in any kind of industry or sector. And if you use software or you create software, you are definitely in the open source business. So open source has gained really a lot of importance in the past decade or so, just given the reliance of product and services on the use of open source to build them. So in a nutshell, it really, as open source software, enables new opportunities. It allows a lot of opportunities to become available for organizations once they start relying and adopting open source within their business. So from a strategic perspective, I think there are 6 key opportunities there that drive the adoption of open source and why organizations should take it really seriously and start building up their competence in this field. The first one is another tool. So open source is just another tool in your toolbox. So if you think of a toolbox that consists of investments in academic research, in proprietary research, investments in industry collaboration, in standardization bodies, in startups, et cetera, open source is just one of these building blocks that will allow you to have additional tools to enable value creation for your products and services. The second one is in relation to product dependency. And this is kind of a very interesting part of the slide because I actually used this part of the slide when I was VP at Samsung Research. And I used to do a lot of fundraising for my team. And the questions I would ask people in the room is, can you guess how many of these products actually incorporate open source in them? And typically people would guess, 5, 10, 10, 12, 15, whatever number. And the true answer is all of them. So when you are in an organization where the majority or even all of your products depend on a software ecosystem, and you're not a player or a leader in that ecosystem, you're really in trouble. So as organizations move and go through their digital transformation and start adopting and using and building with open source, being part of that ecosystem as a leader is really extremely important. Business flexibility, and this is really in relation to the licensing flexibility allowed by the open source licenses, where you can build your product and services on top of open source. You can incorporate it with the open source and many other ways. Software is eating the word, and within that kind of large umbrella, open source is the larger part of software. So you cannot be in the software business without being in an open source business. And if you use software and you want to master and become really a great software leader, you have to become a great software open source leader. Innovation and value, this is the Patero principle, where basically 80% of your efforts will go into providing 20% of value, and really 20% of the effort will generate the 80% of the value. So that 80% of effort is really what open source can offer you. And then you can focus your 20% on driving the 80% of the value. And of course, enablement for new products and services. So this is really at a strategic level. There are a lot of practical benefits for open source: time to market, ability to modify the code, etc., etc. We will not be touching on these. I'm just kind of trying to focus more on the strategic aspect. So what is INOSPO? So given the importance of open source software, organizations are going towards a model where they create a program office that manages all open source work across the whole organization. That covers the consumption of open source, the contribution aspect, the compliance aspect, the community aspect, working with open source foundations and standardization bodies, and everything really that touches open source code. And really the principles behind that driving function is that first, we cannot hire all the smart people in the world. There has to be a way for us to collaborate with everybody out there to help us drive our own technical agenda. And open source allows that. The second one is that open source creates a lot of significant value, and the key is how you can claim portion of that value. So you're not going to go and recreate a new operating system or a web engine or a compression library or a machine learning library or framework or deep learning platform. The idea is you go out there and you reuse a lot of that created R&D via open collaboration, and then build on it. And that, whatever you build on it, becomes your proprietary aspect and your own value that you're offering. And then the third principle is that you don't need to create a project to benefit from it. I mean, a lot of companies out there created projects that benefited hundreds and thousands of other organizations. And this really will help and pushes organization to go over the not invented here syndrome and really forget that syndrome and be in a mindset that even if a project was created by a competitor, I'm going to go and evaluate its technical merit. And if it's a good project that I can use, I'm going to adopt it and build on it versus go and spin off my own effort. And these really principles are really critical when it comes to an organization going through its digital transformation and embracing the open source methodology and working methods. So from a strategic perspective, when you look at getting involved in open source, there are really 4 phases that an organization will go through or can go through, depending on their target destination. Everybody starts as a consumer of code. You know, your developers go download code, find it useful, decide to integrate it as part of the product or the service, and now you're using it. The second phase is being a participant. So you're like one step ahead. You start interacting with the community of the different projects you're using, you know, small patches, being active on the mailing list, participating in some events. And then organizations grow from that phase to become kind of a solid contributor to key projects that they rely on for their products and services. And then the final destination or position is the leadership position, where you become kind of a strong leader within a given project community, and in some sense, depending on the projects you use, you know, a strong leader in the ecosystem you're operating within. Of course, not all organizations will want to aim for a leader. A lot of organizations are content being just a user and a participant. Some organizations have kind of higher ambitions, and they want to be an influencer and a contributor. And some organizations have really strong ambitions to become a leader and a mover in the ecosystem. However, everybody starts from a consumer perspective, and they start growing with their usage. So one interesting data points with relation to OSPOs is the recent survey that was done by the To-Do Group. The To-Do Group is an umbrella effort under the Links Foundation. It's open to anyone to participate in, and they focus on sharing best practices across OSPOs, sharing tools, collaborating on guidelines and processes and policies. And every year they do a survey about the adoption of OSPOs, the benefit companies sees from OSPOs, and different trends they see in that ecosystem. So from the 2020 survey, which was released about 2 months ago, I think, some see 6 takeaways here. The first one is OSPO adoption is the highest in the tech industry. So the tech industry, if you are in tech, most likely you have an OSPO. Other industries trail behind, but of course, this is kind of a factor of time. With time, and as we go year over year, we're seeing, based on the 2020 and 2019 surveys, we see adoption of OSPOs in various industries, with tech leading for obvious reasons. Number 2 is that there's really a consensus that OSPO is extremely critical to the success of engineering. You cannot be creating software which uses open source code and not have an OSPO that coordinates all these various efforts and still be super efficient in maximizing your benefits. You need an OSPO, and you need them to help succeed your teams from an engineering perspective. The third one is that the professionalization of OSPOs continues. What that means is it's not just a bunch of people in an organization kind of pretending to run an OSPO, but this is really a formalized effort with a leader for the OSPO and a budget and various resources allocated formally to kick off the effort and run the open source organization within across the company. The fourth takeaway is that there's an increase in open source initiatives and funding. So OSPOs, as soon as they're created, you will start seeing immediate benefits, and then they start growing right away. And I would really encourage you to visit the actual survey. The link is in the slides to learn more and dive into the different details. The fifth takeaway is that there is really a very positive impact from running an OSPO, and organizations and survey participants from dozens of organizations that have an OSPO have testified to that in the survey, and there are a lot of data points shared that setting up an OSPO will have an immediate positive impact on your operation. And lastly but not least is 63% of the respondents that don't have an OSPO said they're planning to initiate one within a year or less. So although there are a bunch of companies in kind of non-tech sectors such as finance, automotive, and many other sectors don't have an OSPO today, however, they're planning to launch an OSPO within a year. So this is really a very important data point just to see and have kind of insights on what other players in the industries, in various industries, are thinking and doing with respect to OSPO, and those who have adopted the OSPO approach to open source, what kind of benefits they've reaped from that involvement. So in terms of organizational model, and there might be a lot of organizations here today that don't have an OSPO yet or are thinking of setting up one, there are different models. There's the very basic one where there's no OSPO. I mean, a lot of organizations don't have a kind of an official or a formal open source program office. A lot of efforts when it comes to open source are run as an ad hoc, in an ad hoc way. And this is really the situation you want to avoid. All right, so you don't want to be on that slide as an example of a company. You want to be an organization with a certain OSPO model that is functioning and operating and removing any kind of friction from using and contributing to open source that exists in your company. A virtual OSPO is a common one where an organization is not necessarily large enough and may not have enough resources to have a dedicated team to formalize a program office for open source. So typically in this situation, you have a virtual OSPO, which is really representatives from different teams getting together and fulfilling the roles and responsibility of what a program office does. A lot of organizations have that, especially in the startup organization and small to medium organizations. And of course, as you have this kind of virtual setup, as the organization grows, you will start using more open source, contributing to more open source activities, and then you will transition to a different OSPO model, which is kind of very, very typical. There's kind of the setup where you have an independent organization within the engineering. When I was at Samsung Research, I led the open source group, and we had exactly this setup. I reported to the president of R&D, or other organization that report to CTO. And then you have your own engineering resources, you have your strategy team, and you have your support. And this is kind of an end-to-end, full, elaborate OSPO setup. And large organizations actually have a similar setup. There are kind of corporate level OSPOs with supporting OSPOs at the business level. So if you are a really large organization with multiple business units, you may have a small OSPO team at the corporate level and other OSPO teams embedded in each business unit. And basically the corporate level OSPO team does a lot of work on policies, foundation work, processes, and the teams at the business unit level, they take that work, customize it to the business team and to the specific business they're in, and run the day-to-day operation. This is a very typical of really large organizations, talking 50,000 headcount and more with multiple business units. And then, there are multiple different iterations, OSPO team within the CTO office, and many other different variations. And I think the key idea here is that one size does not fit all companies. And there's no wrong way of doing it either. You can start with a given model, and then after a while decide that you want to update it and customize it and improve it based on the previous year experience. And then you do that, and a year later, your requirements have changed or your involvement have changed. And then you decide, okay, it's time to reorg a little bit to meet current requirements. And then you continue on doing this. And this is part of the process, and it's actually a very healthy process to do. So for those on the call who have not yet started on OSPO or are really in the early days, kind of my two cents on this is that, don't be afraid of change, and you're not wrong. Whatever you're doing, you're not doing anything wrong. I think the right thing you're doing is that you already started on that journey, and you will update and morph and pivot as needed as you go forward. So, and what's really interesting with respect to OSPOs is the overwhelming benefits it provides. And this is also from the OSPO survey, where 81% of the people who responded from organizations within OSPO confirmed that the program had very positive impact on their policies and practices in relation to software. And of course, you can visit the detailed survey for a lot of information. And one really interesting thing about OSPOs is the life cycle. So a lot of companies start with a small OSPO, and then they grow over time, and then they shrink after that. And I think this is a very healthy and a great indicator of the success of the work, because ideally, if you are running an OSPO, your goal is to make sure that all organizations, all team within your companies are open source aware, they're aware of your policies, of your processes, they understand the compliance principles, they understand how to work with open source. And at that point, you shrink your operation, because ideally everybody should be an open source expert, right? So every company experiences different life cycle, and one life cycle in a given company is not really an indication or something to follow by somebody else. And this goes back to the saying that, not a single size fits all, and every company has its own journey with OSPO. And if a company was successful doing a certain journey, that doesn't mean that if you adopt that same model, you're going to be successful. So be more in tune with the soul of your company, really, from that perspective, and the values and how people work, and adopt that OSPO journey based on what you see internally to your company. In terms of staffing, really staffing an OSPO team depends on a lot of different variables. The size of the company, the business you're in, the number of products you ship, the desired position in the ecosystem. Do you want to just be a user? Do you want to be a participant? Do you want to aim for a leadership position? And all of these different variables affect the number of resources you're going to need and affect really the variety of efforts you will be involved in. However, at a very high level, you're going to need a head of the OSPO. You're going to need a senior software architect who's super aware of the various critical initiatives in open source that relate to your company efforts in terms of product and services. You're going to need a technical evangelist to be your ambassador to these different open source projects and community. You're going to need a compliance engineer and a legal counsel. And that doesn't have to be kind of a full-time resource. All of these resources I mentioned can be part-time as you're starting. And once you formalize your efforts, you're going to switch into full-time and grow your OSPO. And of course, if you look at some of the larger companies, when I was at Samsung, we had hundreds of engineers completely focused on open source development. We had a number of legal counsels dedicated to supporting the efforts. We had dozens of compliance engineers. We had a lot of evangelists and community managers, if you wish. But of course, we had a really large software organization, probably over 45,000 software developers across the whole company, and we needed that type of support from an open source perspective. Now take that and scale it down or up depending on the size of the company, and then you have an idea of how you would want to start with staffing. So what do OSPO's team do? They focus on developing and executing an open source strategy. They oversee the open source compliance efforts of the company. So if you're using open source in products and services and you ship products that include open source code, you're going to need to have a compliance program to ensure that you fulfill the license obligations of all the components used in your product or service. That team also, the OSPO team, does a lot of work on establishing policies and processes, creating guidelines, and providing training so that employees of the companies are aware of the policies and processes and do follow them for a very positive impact on the business. The OSPO team is involved in driving and prioritizing a lot of open source development upstream. Organizations can start using open source code in the dozens components, and it can be in the hundreds of components. But of course, there has to be prioritizing internally because you may not have enough resources to contribute and support all these hundreds of projects you use in your products and services. So you will need a team that's in touch with all the different products and have a very crisp idea about the priority of the open source components in relation to the product and help you have a crystal idea on how you can participate with limited resources in development of upstream projects to the best impact you can have on your product. OSPO's work with open source foundations, there's the Linux Foundations and many other foundations, especially on efforts related to their business. They track internally performance metrics, implement intersourcing practices to make sure that employees within the company follow open development practices, such as those adopted by the open source methodology. They help grow the open source talent within the company. They are advisors on anything and everything related to open source, from compliance perspective to using, contributing, communities, foundations, starting new efforts, launching new projects, and many, many other topics, M&A, acquisitions, and whatnot. They help manage the open source IT infrastructure. This is kind of a unique situation, and some companies do it, some don't. It really depends on your specific setup. And really, their goal is to eliminate friction with respect to open source, whether it's using or contributing to open source. They try to look for indications of problems and concerns and issues, and they target them, they eliminate them, they improve them, they remove them. And then the goal is to make it super easy for developers to use open source, super easy to contribute, and super easy to be part of larger communities of developers and drive value creation for everybody. And of course, one of my favorite responsibility, and I used to exercise it a lot in the past when I was in the OSPO leadership position, is to say no. And this is kind of counter logical, because if you are a leader of the OSPO, you would want more open source activities, and you will get hundreds and hundreds of requests. And it goes with prioritizing, knowing what's really important and where you can put your efforts in and succeed, and knowing what's really not important or it's not the wrong time, and say no to it and put it on the shelf until it's the right time. So this is kind of a summary of the OSPO's roles and responsibility. And of course, they can scale up or down depending on the setup you have in your existing companies. So based from the survey of the to-do group, these are kind of some really interesting responses in relation to the roles of the OSPO. And you can see that the number one most frequently provided answer to the role of open source programs is to foster the culture of open source within the organization. Second one was to focus on open source compliance, execute the open source strategy, communicate the strategy within the company, facilitate effective use of open source, and support with kind of internal infrastructure and so on. So if you look at the top 5, they're in relation to facilitating the use of open source, facilitating the compliance with the licenses, facilitating the contribution of, executing the strategy, and infusing the culture. And this should be really the mission of any OSPO out there trying to set up or being set up in any given company, regardless of the sector or the industry you're in. So there is, I'm going to pause a little bit. There are a couple of questions. How many companies have you seen? The question is from Jari. How many companies grow and shrink? Currently, it still looks like starting. So what I would suggest for this answer is to look at the really kind of leaders today in open source. That can be Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and many other organizations, where you realize that, for instance, in Facebook, the OSPO team is, I think, 4 or 5 people. And why this is just so small is just because everybody in Facebook is really an open source developer or an open source advocate or an open source program manager, really. If you look at Microsoft, I think their OSPO team is maybe 15, no more than 20 people. That's not a reflection of Microsoft investment and efforts in open source. They actually have thousands of developers working open source. It's just a reflection that the culture has reached a point where a lot of developers are actually contributing and working with open source projects. There's a lot of maturity in terms of policies and processes and compliance work that the OSPO really needs to focus on, really key initiative policies, policies and major investments, and everything else is just became part of the culture that it doesn't need a large OSPO. HP is very similar. Samsung is very similar. When I was at Samsung, the OSPO team was a little over 100 people, and then in 2018, 2019, it shrunk. And that shrunk is not really a reflection of less investment. It's just a reflection that the company has been investing in open source for over 10 years, and the culture has reached a point where there is no need for such a large OSPO, because all the developers are actually interacting with open source and using open source, contributing to open source. There is a certain level or a certain degree of maturity in the policies, in the compliance, in the understanding of how to work with open source, so that it became unnecessary to have really large OSPOs. So this is with respect to this question. Of course, a lot of companies starting, they will expand and they will go through a given life cycle. So they will start hiring people or promoting people internally to drive the efforts of an OSPO. And then over a number of years, that team will change quite significantly in terms of roles, responsibilities, function, who they report to. And this is all healthy. I mean, it's part of the process. And eventually they will get to a point of maturity where, hey, we don't need 50 people running as part of the OSPO. We only need 5 or 10, and everybody else is already infused with that culture. And this is really a great sign that the initial OSPO team has done really a great job in getting the company to that point. The second question also from Jerry is, any tips on how to track the upstream contribution developers to make sure that they do get credit for their efforts? So this is a great question because actually most companies out there do request that developers contributing to open source projects on their behalf actually contribute using a company email ID. So if I work at the Linux Foundation and I contribute to open source project, I have to contribute using my Ibrahim at linuxfoundation.org ID, because that allows my company to figure out, what kind of contributions we're making to the project, and to make sure that our contribution as an organization is counted as such, and not basically contributing from my personal email address, say Gmail address, right? Where it's going to be very hard for anyone other than those who know me personally to know that, hey, these contributions are actually sponsored by the employer and are coming from the Linux Foundation. So the best way to track that is to make sure that the developers use the company email ID, because that's the unique ID that you can track commits with. So back to the presentation. So enabling open source infrastructure. So there are really two key infrastructures here. The first one is consumption and compliance, and consumption and compliance go hand in hand, because if you don't use and adopt open source code and use it in a product or service, there's no need to comply with the licenses, right? Because you're not building anything. So if you're not using, then you don't need to have a compliance program. So they're put together in this slide. So you need to have this really infrastructure, and it can get a little overwhelming. When you look at it, you're going to ask me, hey, Ibrahim, do I need to implement those, different 30 boxes? My answer is eventually, yes, you will get there. But at the beginning, as you're establishing, you're going to implement, 5, 6 boxes initially, and grow that implementation to make sure that you cover all these different boxes, and you make sure that you have internal policies and processes that encompasses all of them. But initially, to start with, you're going to start with just a policy and a process and a strategy, and start building up from there. And typically, it will take you 2 to 3 years to get to a point where you have all of these things implemented. I will not go in details into each one of them. I just want to be respectful of the time and make sure I cover all the key aspects. In terms of contribution, so once a company moves from being just a user and grows to become a contributor, they need to expand their infrastructure. And this is not a hard infrastructure as IT, it's just infrastructure in terms of policies, processes, and internal efforts to drive that involvement. So when it comes to contribution, you're going to need to have a policy and process to decide on where we're going to contribute, who's going to contribute, what guidelines should developer respect when committing code to public repos. And at that point, you may consider starting a dedicated team, and of course, start looking into getting involved in open standards and open efforts that are not necessarily code related, but standardization related, and using open source as a tool to implement reference implementation or provide reference implementation to these different open standards. There are a lot of non-technical focus areas for OSPOS. So we talked a lot about code, about consuming and contributing and compliance. And of course, the questions that came in, reflected that. But also there are a number of non-technical areas that OSPOS focus on. These are related to strategy, to planning, to a lot of the initial work on launching a new projects, to creating mentorship program, working with open source foundations, creating internal infrastructure, engaging with communities, supporting events, creating events, a lot of efforts in relation to training, to shifting the culture to be in support of open source and the collaboration model. And really, one of my favorite is the last bullet on the right-hand side, which is sensing technology trends and trying to figure out, where technology is going and how should we drive our efforts in a given technology open source sector, so that, in a couple of years, we're going to be ready for whatever happens then, given our estimations. And really, by looking at the different open source projects and driving a lot of metrics on, where our competition is putting a lot of efforts, who's contributing what functionality, why they're doing this, how does that relate to their products and services, and so on, you can derive a lot of insights. And this is kind of what I call technology sensing. So there are a lot of challenges. So you're going to start down this road in the energy sector as an effort to drive the digitization of power system, and you're going to need an OSPO or at least various individuals, at least at the beginning, working in this space. And then whether you are in the energy sector, whether you are in the telecom, in finance, in automotive, in healthcare, in the government, or any other type of industry, you're going to face all of these different challenges and maybe some more. And what's really, really important to keep in mind in this case for you is that everybody that came before you faced these challenges, and I can guarantee that you will go through them, and anyone after you jumping on that digital transformation and using open source as an enabler technology will go through these different challenges. However, you have the benefit of looking at dozens and hundreds of organizations that came before you in other technology sectors and see how they dealt with these different challenges and shorten the period of time to resolve them, right? So if you look at IBM, that really made a huge announcement in 2000, announcing that they are investing $1 billion in Linux and open source. Okay, so that in 2000, $1 billion was really a huge thing. And also in 2000, somebody investing in Linux and open source in general was unheard of. It was really the super early days of enterprise open source. So IBM came in and said, I'm putting down $1 billion over the next 3 years in transforming my business and betting on Linux and open source. And then they did the same thing in 2010 when they announced $1 billion on open source cloud. So this is just an example of a company that was among the super early adopters and went through all of these different challenges. So today we can go and use IBM as a study case, or we can use Intel. Intel established their OSPO team, Open Source Technology Center, OTC, back in 2002, and Google around 2007, 2008 after their Android acquisition and so on. So there are a lot of free good examples that we can look into and see, how did IBM or Google or Qualcomm or Intel or many other companies or Facebook for that matter solve the culture challenges? How did they deal with processes? What kind of tool did they use today to enable better use and better consumption and compliance and contribution to open source? How do they ensure continuity of their strategy, of their project, of the executive support to their open source strategies? And how do they deal with the education aspect at different levels, whether it's technical or non-technical training or even peer knowledge transfer? So you have really the advantage of looking at all these different experiences and learning from them and resolving the challenges and applying these use cases to your specific companies. And this is something a lot of companies had to deal with firsthand, and they didn't have any kind of blueprints to follow, but you do. So despite the fact that you're going to face these challenges, I'm really personally assured that these challenges exist. They will always exist in any type of new function you're going to create. But the positive thing is we know how to deal with them and we know how to address them and resolve them. With respect to the challenges, this is also reflected in the OSPO survey that was run by the To-Do group. So what you see on the slide number 36 are the responses from the survey that showcases the challenges in establishing an open source program office. They talk about strategy, setting up a policy, getting executive support, getting legal support, legal staff, having a budget, finding a strong program manager for the program, and so on. So these are really common challenges across all organizations. And what's really interesting is really what you will see in front of you is the first largest challenge is the strategy. And this is your starting point. So as an organization in the energy sector, and I'm going through that process today, my first exercise is what is my open source strategy? And even before I get to that, I need to have a software strategy. So what is my software strategy? And the open source software component is kind of a large building block of that software strategy. And I think in the future, we're internally discussing having a dedicated workshop purely focused on the strategy aspect. How do you get started what should your strategy include? How do you go about setting up, creating a strategy, getting buy-in for it internally, and going and executing it? So if you are today in this call and you are about to go through this exercise, your starting point is the strategy. What is your open source strategy? And create a document that encapsulates the various ideas, input from different people in your organizations, and use it as a building block to start figuring out the strategy, and from that derive an execution plan. So of course, there are a lot of recommendations on how you can make an impact. As organizations start getting involved in open source, there are really a ton of ideas that will help these different organizations to have a better return on investment, if you wish, with respect to their open source investments. Investments meaning, new project they're launching, investment in terms of resources, investments in terms of budgets and spending being done in this space. So I will go through this quite quickly, just for the sake of time. Create an open source program office. This is very obvious. It's my #1 recommendation. Hire or promote a leader to lead the office. Oftentimes companies sometimes try to look for kind of new blood from outside the company, and in many cases they overlook that there's a lot of really good talent inside the company. So look to promote or hire somebody if you don't have internal resources for this office. Build up the initial team. The initial team can be 3 or 4 people, it can be more, but you need that core, the leader, the evangelist, the architect, and start from there. And that's going to be your core team, and build from there. Develop and execute the open source strategy. So you created the OSPO team, you formalize the office. The next thing you need to do is, what's your strategy? Create a plan and then execute it. Identify your reliance on open source. So today, a lot of organizations may be using open source, are using open source, they don't know to what extent. Do a survey internally, do a software composition analysis on all the code you use, identify where you use open source, in what capacity, how critical it is, and that will help you prioritize your efforts and also prioritize where you should put your contribution resources. Identify your current and target open source position. That means, today we are a user, and our target position in 3 years to be a contributor, and then chart a path from now to 3 years from today, and with quarterly milestones, and then take these quarterly milestones and divide them over monthly deliverables and so on, right? And that will help your planning be a lot more tangible and goal driven, of course. Implement an enabling environment. This can mean a lot of things. One of them is IT enabling. You don't want your firewall to block access to GitHub, for example. And this is a very basic example, but you get the idea. Provide flexible IT infrastructure. This is kind of a given. Build open source expertise. A lot of the expertise, when people think of open source, think of technical expertise, experts in the kernel, or expert in edge technologies, or experts in open source AI. But a lot of the expertise area also fall on the business side. You need experts on open source strategy, experts on running an open source operation, experts on ecosystem development, experts on partnership on the open source side, experts on working with foundations, and legal experts. So it's not just technical. So when you're building that organization, you're going to look at a spectrum of talent that you need, and technical is one of them, but there are many other aspects to that. And one of the things that you're going to be looking at is creating metrics and figuring out what metrics should we track to figure out, are we doing the right thing? Are we executing? Are we getting positive results? And basically, the basic sense is that if you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. So you need to be able to have measurable metrics that you track, and on a monthly basis or quarterly basis, get back to them, figure out how you performed, and do a course correction. And there are actually a lot of literature out there from companies, and I've personally written on this topic about the importance of having this, and provided some example of metrics that you can adopt for that purpose. Offer training. Work with open source foundations. Linux Foundation is a great example. We're here. This is a foundation event. A lot of critical infrastructure projects are being hosted in the Linux Foundation and other foundations. So getting involved in open source foundation on projects related to your industry is really a key responsibility of the OSPO and the organization as a whole. Establish a framework for open sourcing code. Let's say you have a project internally, you want to open source. How do you go about doing this? You need a certain framework that guide the process of taking that code from being initially proprietary and getting through a journey to one day waking up and it's on GitHub and it's active and it has mailing list and it has a website and it has thriving community. So you need a framework. You need to develop that framework and figure out how to drive that project from A to Z in a very successful way. Foster internal collaboration. Part of the open source really methodology is I don't think organizations can really work successfully in the open source model if they're not able to work openly together within the walls of their organization. So fostering internal cooperation and looking into intersourcing is kind of a practice, if you wish, before going and doing that with external organizations and external collaborators. Exploring intersourcing practices, I mentioned that on the previous slide. Getting involved with open source events, this is really a great way to learn about what's going on in the world in your specific industry with respect to open source, sponsoring events, sending speaker to events, and even hosting your own, and trying to embed yourself as part of the open source community that is relevant to your industry and your sector. Establishing projects with universities, this is often underlooked. In previous roles, I've executed really dozens of collaboration projects with universities, and a lot of really good ideas came out of that funneled directly into products and services. And open source is the actual framework you can work with. So when you think of open source, it's a community. Academics have their own community. Academics love to publish. We love to go speak at events. Academics and academia and people in the industry can collaborate on projects licensed under an open source license. So there's a lot of chemistry there. And a lot of ideas can come frequently from universities' thesis work. Update your software procurement practices as you start getting more involved with open source. Open source will come through your company, through your supply chain. So you need to have up-to-date procurement practices that include adopting a new way of new types of agreement, making sure that you're getting notice of everything open source entering your organization from third-party software provider, looking into open chain as a way to certify yourself and also certify your software service providers as well. Formalizing an open source career path is another way to kind of strengthen the internal community of open source developers by having kind of a career path for them. And remember, the metrics for open source developer differ a little bit than the metrics for internal developers. So let's say an open source developer is tasked to execute a given implementation, but that developer goes online and they convince the community about the idea and they drive an implementation as part of the community effort. So at the end of the day, that developer from your organization didn't personally implement the functionality. How do you work with their performance review, right? Because the functionality was implemented, but it wasn't implemented by him. So this is kind of just one example of the need to formalize performance reviews and different metrics to measure the performance of open source developers. It's really a lot of information, and I apologize in advance. I wanted to make sure I cover everything before I kind of stop. So the deck will be available online, and I hope to do a kind of a more deep down event in the future with you on specific topics. So I will pause here, and there are about 8 minutes left for questions. So I'm going to pause and take in any questions. Thank you.
I also did share your LinkedIn, and I don't know if you welcome any questions after this presentation as well, Ibrahim.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so I'm going to type in my email, or actually it's even on my slides. I'm going to type in my email, and people are more than welcome to to send me their questions. However, a very friendly warning, I may not be able to be very prompt on these. So please allow 24 to 48 hours before I get back to you, just given the workload.
Awesome. I'm sure a lot of people are digesting this information. And just to make sure everyone has it, I will put that LinkedIn again, which will take you to Ibrahim's direct LinkedIn account. We have 7 more minutes. If anyone else has any final questions, feel free.